Hello, viewers. Today we're working on a 2017 Toyota Corolla with the 1.8-liter engine, and we are going to be replacing the spark plugs on this. Welcome back to the Moose Mobile Auto Repair channel. And so we are going to be replacing the spark plugs today. This vehicle is approaching close to 104,000 kilometers. And so I recommended to the customer to replace the spark plugs. And I recommended to replace the spark plugs a little bit early than what the manufacturer states. Recently, I made a video regarding these Denso Toyota spark plugs, so I will put the link on the screen here, and I'll also post it in the description and in the comments section below. So I was saying that the service interval is 192,000 kilometers or 120,000 miles roughly. And so I recommend to replace the spark plugs at around 100,000 kilometers, roughly 60 to 62,000 miles, for a variety of reasons. And it's mainly because that you don't want to leave spark plugs inside the cylinder head for all that long. So you want to make sure that you replace them at periodic intervals, because you don't want the spark plugs to get seized inside the cylinder head. And so you will avoid a lot of problems in the future when you replace the spark plugs early. I did mention a variety of things in my previous video, such as that if you leave the spark plugs in for too long and over the service interval is going to put more stress on the ignition coils and the ignition system. So anyhow, we are going to get started on replacing the spark plugs now. So I didn't want to talk too much, so I'm just going to get started with the job now, because I already made a previous video regarding these spark plugs. So I don't want to make the video any longer for you guys. So we are going to remove the cover. You want to lift up at one corner at a time. You don't want to lift them up at the same time, because it's possible to break this plastic cover. So only lift at one corner at a time. So remove the engine cover out of the way. So now you have access to the 4 ignition coils. So all you have to do is to lift up on the tab, to push on the tab, and you should be able to get the connectors out off. If you're having a hard time, you can use a small flathead or pocket screwdriver of some sort to lift on the tabs carefully. So you want to lift on the tab carefully. If you're not able to get it out, you want to be extremely careful to not break these. And then you just need to do the same for the other ones. You just need to push on the tab to pry gently on the connector. You want to be extremely careful. I forgot to mention that you want to make sure that when you are replacing the spark plugs, that you are replacing it while the engine has cooled down. You want to do this on a cold engine. You don't want to do this on a hot or a very warm engine, because then that's going to damage uh, the threads inside the cylinder head. So if the engine is hot, you want to wait for a couple hours or so, or wait until the next day until the engine has cooled down, so you don't do any damage. So now we're going to remove the ignition coils. They are 10 millimeters. I'm just using a Milwaukee electric ratchet. So this is a 3/8 drive, 10 millimeter deep socket. You can also you can use a wrench, or a handheld hex screwdriver. It doesn't really matter as long as you're able to get the bolts off. You can use something like this, a handheld screwdriver, to get the bolts out if you want, if you're able to. But the bolts will be on extremely tight. So I'm just doing this for the sake of demonstration purposes. It's very tight. So you may not be able to use this unless there's like a hex end here. And you would be able to, you could be able to use a wrench. There's a hex on the handheld screwdriver. So anyhow, we're just gonna do this. All of the bolts are all the same size, so you don't need to worry about mixing them up. So we are going to remove the ignition coils. You just need to wiggle it out of the way and you will be able to get them out. And meanwhile, you can inspect them for any damage or cracks, or if you see any arcing inside the boot. So far, these ones, they look fine. I'm not seeing anything. This is the original Toyota Denso ignition coils. If you guys are looking for ignition coils from the dealership or online, I will put the part number on the screen for you guys. Yeah, 90919 02258. On this one, the numbers are kind of blurred out. So I will put the part number on the screen in case if you guys need ignition coils. So I'm just using a 14 millimeter spark plug socket. This is by AST SP1412. This is also for the BMWs and the Mini Coopers. So I used to work on them back in the days. I don't work on them too often now. So this is a 12-point spark plug socket, but this also works for this application as well. I like to use this because it's easy to get the spark plug in and out because there are sometimes some of my other spark plug sockets, they get stuck after the install, and then I have to use a magnet. And so this one, they come out pretty easy because it's very thin. This is I think they call it a long reach, 14 millimeter or 9/16 long reach spark plug. So just a long extension and a 3/8 drive ratchet. So we're going to get in there to take the spark plugs out now. If for any reason you're having a hard time trying to remove the spark plugs, you can spray a little bit of WD-40 or penetrating oil inside the spark plug hole as you are trying to take out the spark plug if you're having a hard time. Sometimes I like to use this to remove the spark plugs out. It's safe to use. It won't do any damage. It's just to speed up the process for the sake of time. So this is the first one. We'll take this out. SC16HR11. It's the same exact spark plug that I got from the dealership. So make sure that you have the exact same spark plug and they are at the same length, the same height. I once had an incorrect spark plug, which was a slightly longer. So you have to be careful because if you use a spark plug that's slightly longer and you're still able to put it in the engine, you could damage the engine. I've seen some spark plugs that were slightly too long, and so the piston is going to hit the spark plug as it's moving up. So make sure you have the right parts and everything is the same length. So we are going to proceed to remove the rest of the spark plugs now. On these spark plugs, the manufacturer has stated to not adjust the gap for the new ones. So do not adjust the gap. If the gap is incorrect, then you need to get a new spark plug. The gaps should not be adjusted on modern day vehicles today for any reason. So we're going to take this one out. And meanwhile, while you are doing the spark plugs, you can inspect inside the spark plug hole just to make sure there's no oil leaks inside because of the spark plug tubes or the valve cover gasket. There are sometimes you might see oil inside. So you can use like a handheld, a flashlight or something to look inside the spark plug hole to see if there's any oil inside. And usually if there's any oil inside, you'll see the spark plugs will be covered up in oil. And so that would mean that the spark plug tubes are no good. It's basically it's part of the valve cover gasket. So here's the number 2 spark plug now. These ones are not too bad. They probably still have a little bit of life to it. The insulator is a little bit worn out. You may not be able to see it on camera too well. Also, make sure that when you are doing spark plug changes, that to make sure that the rubber piece is still in here and not inside the engine or on the spark plug. On the new or the old spark plug, make sure that the rubber piece is still inside here. I check that uh, routinely just to make sure. I'm gonna do the third one now. These spark plugs are relatively easy to do. Easy job. You can get it done in in like an hour or less. Easy peasy. Number three. If you notice here, you can see how it's all brown. Uh, there are sometimes combustion gases can leak past the gasket, and so you might see this. Now, I did some research in the past, and in some stuff has stated that these are not combustion gases, but they call it a corona stain or something. So it's not anything uh, to be extremely uh, like worried about. It's an indicator to note that it's been in the engine for long enough, so you know that these spark plugs have been in here for quite some time. Last one. Yeah, the cowl is a little bit in the way, so it can make things difficult. You may need to lift up slightly on the cowl. And this is the number four. Now, sometimes you can use like a ramp style spark plug checker just to check the old spark plug, just for the sake of just for experimental purposes. It's roughly 40 thousandths of an inch, 0.040 of an inch. So that is basically is roughly on what the gap is when it's brand new. So typically uh, the spark plug gap hasn't changed much on these spark plugs, and surprisingly that these spark plugs are still going, and they call them Iridium long life spark plugs. So usually the spark plug gap will increase uh, with time due to all of the heat. So it will expand the uh, the electrode tip or the ground tip, and so that will expand with time. So anyhow, we're going to install the new spark plugs. This one is the new one. I got it straight from the dealership. So just be careful with the spark plugs, because there's a lot of counterfeit spark plugs going around these days. So you want to be extremely careful. So before I install the spark plugs, I like to put a little bit of anti-seize. This is the silver grade stuff. You can also use the the brown or the orangey brown copper stuff as well if you want. I'm just gonna put a light coat of anti-seize on the spark plugs. I'm just gonna put a thin coat. Usually I just like to use my pinky finger to spread the anti-seize, and then that's it. You don't need to put too much anti-seize on this. So I like to put some starting at the top, and so when you thread the spark plug inside the engine, the anti-seize will spread all across the threads on the spark plug. Insert this carefully. You may need to push up on the cowl, and I like to thread these by hand all the way, so you make sure that you don't cross thread them. Just I like to tighten them down by hand until I'm not able to go any further. I just like to make sure that it's in all the way there, because the last thing I want is problems. So I already deal with enough problems on the vehicles today, so you don't want any more extra problems. Uh, you don't want to create any extra problems for yourself. So this one is the second one, the same procedure. Now I know that they state that there is a coating on the spark plugs already, but the issue with that is that sometimes the coating is not enough. Sometimes they put like a nickel or a zinc coating, and so sometimes the coating is not enough in some climates and conditions. And so I always like to put anti-seize. I've been doing this for the last 16 years now. I've never had a problem. So I always make sure I put anti-seize on the thread, so that the next time the spark plug replacement comes, you're able to get them out. There's been a long debated controversy regarding anti-seize on the spark plugs. So to each their own. You can do on whatever you want. It has stated that when you apply anti-seize to fasteners and things like spark plugs, you are supposed to reduce the torque by approximately 20 to 30% if you apply anti-seize. But I don't normally do that. I just follow the recommended torque spec, and usually I'm still good. So there shouldn't be any issues. But you can do that if you want. You might not have any problems, but uh, I'm only putting a light coat of anti-seize. I'm not dipping the spark plug inside the bottle of anti-seize. So it's only a thin coat. So it's not going to be that big of a deal. Forgot to mention, this is the Toyota part number if you want to get these spark plugs yourself. It comes in the Toyota Genuine or the Lexus Genuine box. Toyota Motor Corporation, made in Indonesia. I'm going to install the last one. You want to be careful to not drop spark plugs. If you drop the spark plugs, I highly I recommend to replace them. Do not adjust the gap. The issue is one problem I've seen and heard and came across with the spark plugs. The issue is that back in the day, I like to use the ramp style spark plug gap checker tool. So the problem with this is that there is usually a coating or a piece of metal that's on the electrode tip. So there are some instances in which if you use a ramp style spark plug checker tool, you could break off that tiny coating. So the issue with that is that even if you're careful or not careful, it's still possible to remove the coating off of there. It's very hard to show you there. Even if you are careful and you use this, it's possible to damage the coating and then the spark plug is garbage. So that's why now I don't check the gap anymore. I just do a very quick visual inspection and comparison, and then that's it. If you're careful, extremely careful, you may be able to get away with it. I have used this in the past, and I've gotten away with it, but you have to watch out to not damage the coating here because it's easy to damage the spark plugs. And then there's the other style spark plug checker tool over here. It's like a wire style spark plug checker. I think these ones are maybe a bit safer to use, but still you have to be careful. So just proceed with caution when you are checking the gaps. So it's just it's a matter of preference. In the end, I'm not gonna say that there's a right or a wrong answer as long as you are following the service procedures properly and you are taking all of the precautions necessary, then you should be okay. So now I'm going to tighten up the spark plugs just by hand, snug first before I use a torque wrench. I'm going to be torquing these spark plugs to 15 foot-pounds according to what the service information states. So usually I just like to tighten it until it's tight, and then usually until the spark plug contacts the head. And some guys they may do like a quarter or a 1/8 of a turn to tighten it if you don't use a torque wrench. And in most cases you might be fine, but in some cases it might cause problems because on the new spark plugs, I forgot to mention that on the new spark plugs they have a crush washer over here. So this washer or sealing washer gets crushed when you are tightening up the spark plugs. So it's very imperative to use a torque wrench if you are able to, so you can get the exact tightness of the spark plug so this washer can seal against the combustion chamber properly. If you don't use a torque wrench, there's a possibility that this washer won't seal 100%. So, uh, in most cases, if you tighten the spark plug snug, you'll probably be okay in a majority of cases. It's just those rare cases in which, and on some engines, they are finicky. So you gotta make sure. I always try to use a torque wrench as much as possible on engine components because the last thing you want is is to have any problems. So because it's very easy to access, it's not a big deal to use a torque wrench, even though that the technicians and or mechanics, they have the feel for tightening up to a certain amount, and that usually works. But there are some cases on some vehicles, the proper torque is very important, because sometimes it's easy to under tighten it or to over tighten it, and sometimes you may think it's tight enough, and then later the spark plug goes loose after a few thousand kilometers. So you're probably better off to use a torque wrench and to torque it properly. So I'm just going to switch ratchets to my traditional ratchet, the shorter one. So just making sure that it's snug, and then I'm going to torque them after that. If I didn't have a torque wrench, this is how I normally tighten up the spark plugs, depending on the engine, if it's aluminum or cast iron, and if it's if the spark plug has a washer or doesn't have a washer. So this one has a washer, so the torque spec is a tiny bit more. The ones without a washer, on some of the Fords and GM, on some of them, they don't utilize a separate sealing washer on the spark plug. So the torque spec will be slightly less in some cases. So that's that. I'm going to use a torque wrench now. So I set the torque wrench to 15 foot-pounds. I'm going to go back to the first one because it wasn't torqued all the way yet. That's the issue sometimes. You may think it's tight, but it's not tight. So you have to be careful there. So sometimes using the torque wrench, it does give me a little bit of anxiety for engine stuff. So you need to be really careful. And then the last one. I'm going to stop there. So just on some engines, it makes me a little nervous, even though I've done it hundreds or thousands of times now. But still, I still get that nervous feeling when using a torque wrench. So you got to make sure that your torque wrenches are calibrated properly. And yeah, that's it. So everything is all torqued, and we're going to install the ignition coils back now. Even though I've been doing this for quite some time, I still get very nervous uh, using a torque wrench. And if you want, sometimes you may be able to use a smaller one to reduce the leverage, so you don't accidentally over tighten the components that you are working with. So you still need to be careful, proceed with caution, and use your common sense. So I've been using this Mac Tools torque wrench for quite some time. Haven't had a problem with this yet. So I'm using the Super Lube stuff, dielectric grease. So I like to put a little bit of dielectric grease inside the coil here, so that it makes a good contact, and so it doesn't seize up. And I like to put a tiny amount inside the connector housing. Do the same for all four. Make sure everything is in, and don't make sure that to not uh, forget the rubber piece on the bottom of the coils. So make sure that they are not missing. And we have the bolts. I like to put also the same dielectric grease on the bolt, just a tiny amount. And you can start the bolts by hand first. These bolts don't need to be tightened too much. I'll put the torque spec on the screen for you guys to see. Install the bolt here. Connectors in the way. We're going to tighten down the bolts. Just snug. You should be good. Install the connectors. Make sure you hear the audible click. And you want to tug on the connectors. Make sure it's in, just to double check. Then you should be all good to go after that. So we're just going to start the vehicle up. Just make sure that the vehicle it runs and drives okay. We are probably going to go for a road test later on. So everything feels okay so far. I'm gonna take it for a road test after I'm done, and then that's it. So once you're done, everything uh, uh, it, it it looks good. and sounds good, then just reinstall the engine cover. So the engine is running, everything sounds good and looks good, and we're all done. I'm just going to go for a road test and confirm that everything is okay, and then that's it. That's it for today. If you enjoyed this video and found it helpful, please don't forget to give it a like, and please consider subscribing to my channel if you're not already a subscriber, and I'll see you guys in the next one. Have a good day and take care.